Anna of Austria and Mariana Victoria of Bourbon were both queens of Portugal for the better part of the 18th century. More than that, they were family, mother and daughter-in-law. For a quarter of a century, they lived in the court of Lisbon in a proximity that went from love to hate in just a few years. Anna of Austria controlled every aspect of her daughter-in-law's life, and Mariana Victoria resented her deeply for it. But their relationship is much more complex than that. Not only did they came from extremely different backgrounds, one was Austrian and the other one was Spanish, their experiences in the Portuguese court were a clear contrast, just like their personalities. But in the end, they had more in common than they might have thought. So on this video, I'm going to try to find out what was the relationship between these two women like and the causes for their feud. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe. Anna of Austria and Mariana Victoria met for the first time on January of 1729 in the middle of the Caia, the river that serves as the south frontier between the Kingdom of Portugal and the Kingdom of Spain. Anna was 46 years old at that time and had been Queen of Portugal for more than 2 decades. Mariana Victoria, by contrast, was only 10 years old. Generally, a princess at such a young age wouldn't have much to tell, but that wasn't the case of Mariana Victoria. She was born in Madrid in 1718, and she was the third child and the first daughter of the kings of Spain, Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV of France, and the first Bourbon monarch of Spain, and his second wife, Elizabeth, an Italian princess from the house of Farnese. At a very young age, Mariana Victoria was promised in marriage to an equally young Louis XV. In 1722, she moved to France, where she would await to be old enough to marry Louis and become the queen of that kingdom. Throughout her life, Mariana always manifested a great attachment to her mother, and from France she started a stream of letters to Elizabeth that lasted until the death of the Queen of Spain in 1766. Miraculously, a large quantity of these letters survived, allowing us to sneak inside Mariana's world, her moods and opinions, as well as her personality and inner thoughts. Mariana learned to write in France, and her letters describe the life of a royal child, filled with games and amusements, gardens, flowers, and gifts, like the magnificent doll her future husband offered her on the day she arrived in Paris. Mariana, now called the Queen Infanta, lived in the Louvre under the care of the Duchess of Ventadour, who held the title of governess of the children of France. In her letters, Mariana called her affectionately Maman Ventadour, and informed her mother that the royal family loved her and that she seemed to be the center of all the attentions of the French court. Elizabeth Charlotte, Duchess of Orleans, described Mariana Victoria as the most beautiful and adorable child in the world, and she too offered the little Queen Infanta a splendid doll for her to play. But this idyllic life didn't last long. Louis XV was at this point the only living legitimate heir of Louis XIV. He was almost 15 and still unmarried and without children. It was urgent that he married and produce an heir as soon as possible. The problem was that Mariana Victoria was too young to marry, let alone to give birth to an heir. It was decided that Louis XV couldn't wait any longer and Mariana Victoria would be returned to Spain in order to find the French king a new bride. In March of 1725, the French ambassador in Spain presented Philip V and Elizabeth Farnese a letter informing them the decision to return their daughter to Spain. The return of the Spanish princess was an humiliation to Spain and to Philip and his family. This rejection by the French could destroy Mariana's prospects of ever getting married, as she could have to bear the stain of having been repudiated for the rest of her life. In April, Mariana Victoria left Versailles forever. The reason for her journey to Spain was kept a secret to her, and she believed she was only going to do a quick visit to her parents. Contrary to the idea that was created in her lifetime, Mariana didn't seem to hold a personal hate towards France and the French king. Almost half a century later, she still remembered every detail in every statue of the Park of Versailles as if she had just left. The 6-year-old Mariana was back in Madrid living with her family. Her parents were now desperate for a solution to save her reputation and show the rest of Europe, and especially France, that her daughter could have an even better marriage. And that solution didn't take long to appear in the minds of the kings of Spain. Since the end of the Iberian Union in 1640 and the War of the Restoration that followed, the Portuguese and the Spanish royal families hadn't had any marriage between them, and the relationship between the two kingdoms was, for a good reason, not as fraternal as it was in the previous centuries. Almost immediately after the announcement by the French of the return of the Spanish princess, Madrid proposed an alliance with Portugal consisting of a double marriage. Mariana Victoria would marry with Prince Joseph, the heir to the Portuguese crown, and his sister, the Princess Maria Barbara, would marry with Ferdinand, the heir to the Spanish throne. To the Spanish, not only this would solve the issue with Mariana, but it would also give them the possibility to mine the relationship between Portugal and England, bringing their neighbors to their side. To the Portuguese, this alliance could also be useful, solving some territorial problems between the Spanish and the Portuguese colonies in South America. The idea of having a Portuguese princess in the Spanish throne also didn't displease the court of Lisbon, opening the possibility of a stronger Portuguese influence in Spanish politics. For these reasons, the Spanish proposal was met positively in Lisbon, but the negotiations lasted for years, delaying these marriages until 1729. On January of that year, a very special ceremony took place in the border between the two kingdoms. This ceremony became known as the Exchange of the Princesses. Over the Caia River, a large pavilion was built. This ephemeral building consisted of 3 areas, 2 antechambers on each side, one for the Spanish and one for the Portuguese entourages, connected by a large hall right in the middle of the river where the ceremony would take place. Maria Barbara and Mariana Victoria were to be exchanged simultaneously. One would cross to Spain and the other to Portugal. This ceremony is considered by historians as the high point of performative ceremonial in Baroque Portugal. On both sides it was clear that this was a moment to show off and impress the other faction in an exercise of power and wealth display. The preparations had begun years in advance and the final cost was colossal, almost leading some noble families to bankruptcy. 30 years later, a visitor to Portugal noted that some families still hadn't fully recovered financially from this ceremony. If the Spanish side impressed by the numbers of people present, around 16,000, the Portuguese side dazzled with its sumptuosity. At the last minute, the unexpected happened. The kings of Spain announced that they would accompany their daughter to the frontier. For reasons of protocol and etiquette, this demanded the presence of the kings of Portugal in the ceremony as well. On the 19th of January, on what was already an extraordinary event, something even more exceptional happened. The Portuguese and the Spanish royal families met face to face. This event was extraordinary because of its rarity, as it was not common in this period for a meeting like this to occur between two royal families. Every inch of this ceremony was choreographed to ensure a perfect balance of precedence between the Portuguese and the Spanish kings. It was at this moment that Mariana Victoria met the woman that would be her mother-in-law for the next decades, the Queen of Portugal, Mariana of Austria. As was said before, these two women had very different experiences in the Portuguese court. Mariana of Austria, the daughter of Emperor Leopold I and his wife, the Empress Leonor Magdalena, arrived in Lisbon in 1708, at 25 years old, to marry the then 19-year-old John V, King of Portugal. Not only was she much older than Mariana Victoria on her arrival in Portugal, but the Austrian Archduchess immediately became its queen. More than that, Maria Anna didn't have to deal with her parents-in-law, as both King Peter II of Portugal and his second wife, Queen Maria Sophia of Neuburg, were already dead. On her hand, Mariana Victoria had to live under her mother-in-law's shadow for the next 25 years. The relationship between Mariana and Mariana Victoria started off very well. Immediately after the ceremony, the Spanish Infanta, now titled the Princess of Brazil, was still crying from the separation from her parents. Moments before, even the kings of Portugal had difficulty containing their feelings before their only daughter, Maria Barbara, who was also covered in tears, left with the Spanish kings to her new home. To calm the little princess, the King of Portugal held her in his arms and seated her in the carriage, immediately stopping her crying. Mariana Victoria and Prince Joseph were married that same night in the Cathedral of Elvas, but the kings of Portugal didn't allow them to consummate their marriage due to Mariana's young age. With time, this issue would become a source of conflict between Mariana Victoria and her mother-in-law, who wished to delay it as much as possible. The marriage between Mariana and Joseph was a success. In her letters to her mother, Mariana describes her new husband as handsome and charming to her, showering her with attentions and gifts. She wrote to her mother informing her that he loved her very much and that she loved him in return. She even adds, with a certain exaggeration that was typical of hers, that she was mad for him and that there was nothing that they wished more than to live like husband and wife. Mariana also informs her mother that the queen loves her, as well as the king. But in the same letters, she also noticed how strange it was for her the fact that the Queen of Portugal never kissed her own children. But as Mariana herself wrote, the queen was certainly a saint. The Spanish ladies who accompanied the new Princess of Brazil also informed her parents about her life and her relationship with her new family. Maria Teresa Rojano noted that every time the king came to see his daughter-in-law, He gave her more hugs and kisses than he has ever given his own children throughout all his life. Luisa Valendia wrote that the kings liked her very much, gave Mariana everything she wanted, and were very pleased with her. But the issue of the consummation of her marriage became the first source of tension between Mariana Victoria and her parents-in-law, especially the queen, who took this issue very seriously. As was pointed before, the new couple wished to consummate their marriage immediately and live like a true married couple as soon as possible. The kings of Spain were of the same opinion, even though their daughter was only 11. This was possibly because of the previous French rejection. The kings of Spain were anxious for their daughter to consummate her marriage because that would seal the alliance and secure her position. They were probably afraid that the Portuguese would reject Mariana Victoria like the French did. On their side, and without this sort of pressure, the kings of Portugal, with good sense, preferred to let their daughter-in-law grow a little more and become a menstruated woman before sleeping with her husband. After their marriage, Mariana and Joseph lived in the Ribeira Palace, the official residence of the Portuguese monarchs in Lisbon. But because of their young age, they didn't have an apartment for themselves and lived in the apartment of Queen Maria Anna. In 1731, the construction of a new apartment overlooking the river for the Princess of Brazil started. Mariana and her husband were informed that they would be able to sleep together in their new apartment once the works were completed. The king wanted the works to be finished as soon as possible, but the queen was of contrary opinion, arguing that it would still take a very long time for the rooms to be inhabited. Mariana informed her mother that someone told her in secret that the queen didn't want her to sleep with her husband until she was a full woman. The work on the apartment continued. First, the queen said it would take 5 to 6 months for her daughter-in-law to move there. By the end of February of 1732, the work was apparently completed, but the queen still insisted it would take a long time for Mariana to move there. This time she predicted a full year. Mariana wrote to her mother saying, with some irony, that maybe on the day of the Last Judgment. Finally, on her 14th birthday, the king communicated that Mariana Victoria would spend the night with her husband as a birthday gift, because he knew that there was nothing that she wished for the most. On the same night, the queen ordered Mariana's hair to be brushed and help her get into bed. The king did the same with his son, and before they left, the Portuguese kings blessed and advised the young couple. Mariana couldn't be more pleased, and the next day she told her mother that the night went very well, and that during her morning toilette her husband offered her a diamond necklace. This first friction between Maria Anna and Mariana Victoria went by without any damage between mother and daughter-in-law, but it wouldn't take long for these two to collide with each other again. In 1734, Mariana and Joseph were parents for the first time with the birth of Maria, the future Maria I, the first ruling queen in Portuguese history. 2 years later, in 1736, another girl was born, Maria Anna, like her grandmother, the Queen of Portugal. Some months prior to her birth, when the royal family visited the countryside palace of Belém, then on the outskirts of Lisbon, the queen ordered Mariana to leave her daughter in Lisbon, like she used to do with her own children. Mariana, who was pregnant, obeyed, even though she didn't want it to be separated from her baby. That same year marks the beginning of the animosity between Mariana and her parents-in-law, especially with Anna of Austria. Interestingly, this also coincides with a period of postnatal depression by Mariana, proven by her letters to her mother during this time, where she constantly refers to her melancholic state after the birth of her second daughter. During that year, Mariana started complaining about life in the court of Lisbon, where she was constantly deprived from her pleasures and merriments. At 18 years old, the Princess of Brazil liked to have fun and amuse herself with concerts, games and hunts, but that wasn't always possible due to the strict and severe etiquette of the Portuguese court. If Mariana was looking for constant amusement, she was in the wrong place. During the lifetime of her father-in-law, the Portuguese court was known for its austerity. Material luxury was plenty, but the same cannot be said about court society. Decades before, after the arrival of her mother-in-law, the Portuguese court became a little lighter due to the action of Anna of Austria. But as time went by and the kings got older, and especially because of John V, the court became ever more pious and centered around religion. In fact, the king seemed to be obsessed with religion. His palaces were like monasteries, his favorite music was religious music, and his most notorious mistress was a nun, Mother Paulo, who lived like a queen in the monastery of Odivelas. Some years later, Mariana commented that the new wife of the Duke of Cadaval, a French lady of the House of Lorraine, was raised in a convent, so she would have no difficulty adapting to the life in Portugal. Amusements at court existed, and written documentation refers to hunts, dances and serenades, a sort of musical evenings in the queen's apartments, But these were not as abundant as most wished, and even the courtiers had to find their pleasure someplace else, and the city of Lisbon had many to offer. When her brother-in-law Charles died, Mariana complained to her mother that the court would be in mourning for a full year, and that her only distractions would be her music lessons, and even those would probably stop for some months. The following year, she said that in Lisbon they lived the saddest life in the world. In 1737, a manuscript gazette announced that Mariana and Mariana Victoria didn't spoke to each other, but the reason for that was unknown. Probably this was because earlier that year, while Mariana Victoria was sick, the queen asked her if she needed any treatment, but her daughter-in-law gave her an insolent answer. As a punishment, the king then took Mariana with her to visit the churches of Lisbon during Lent. Mariana described this as tyrannical, as she missed an opportunity to get out of the palace. Mariana went as far as comparing her life to slavery, and if it wasn't for the love that she had for her prince, she would ask her parents to take her out of there. Sometimes the two disagree with etiquette. After the birth of her first daughter, Mariana was supposed to receive the ladies of the court in bed, as the queen insisted. Mariana commented that everyone knew that she was already up, and that having to receive the courtiers in bed was ridiculous. Other times, the queen made her daughter-in-law spend hours in church. Because of this, she would rather not accompany the queen, even if she missed a chance to go out. Mariana once even said that the queen must have been a pretty unhappy woman, and that wasn't a surprise as she came from the most miserable of all nations. Gone were the days when she called the queen a saint. In 1742, after John V suffered a stroke, Mariana made her most cruel comment. She said that since the king had become ill, he wouldn't die, but he would turn into a torment for everybody. She criticized the spending of the king, now only willing to spend money with church, and that the queen did nothing about it. Apparently, Mariana also suffered from the lack of attention by her parents-in-law, claiming that they didn't care about her. Because of his condition, John V started visiting the thermal bath of the town of Caldas da Rainha, known for its hot springs. Mariana complained that the queen didn't want her to stay alone in Lisbon, forcing her to go with them. She concludes that, for no reason, the kings didn't trust her to be alone. The kings also insisted that Joseph accompany them, and Mariana commented with some humor that the queen must have thought that her son was a doctor. Mariana got it wrong though, as it was the king who didn't want to leave his son in Lisbon for political reasons. Nevertheless, she immediately pointed Mariana as a responsible. The bad relationship between mother and daughter-in-law had many reasons. Mariana and Mariana Victoria had different personalities. The queen was a tough Austrian with a great sense of duty and piety, but her personality could be read sometimes as cold and hard to deal with. Many decades before, when she arrived in Portugal, her relationship with her husband wasn't always the best. The same couple that gave the princes of Brazil marital advice on their first night as husband and wife was the one that barely talked to each other in the first months of their marriage. Mariana of Austria was accused of being cold. Sometime after her marriage, the king became extremely ill. Mariana would only come out of her apartment for a quick visit, immediately returning to Germany, the names the courtier gave her apartment, apparently showing little interest with her husband. Years later, Mariana was also displeased with her daughter-in-law because she only had baby girls. Mariana Victoria and Joseph had a total of 4 daughters, but no boys. The way that the queen treated the princes of Brazil reflected this disappointment, as if the queen had already forgot the immense pressure that she faced when she took some years to get pregnant. The only difference was that, unlike Mariana, Mariana of Austria didn't have to deal with her mother-in-law. On her hand, Mariana Victoria, although she had a kind heart, comes out as extremely spoiled and selfish. Her letters are full of exaggerations. Remember when she compared her life to slavery? And she tended to dramatize everything. It was natural for a young woman to amuse herself and enjoy some freedom, but every time her distractions were jeopardized, she became cruel and bitter towards her parents-in-law, especially the queen. The bad will that the queen had towards her daughter-in-law can also be explained by the way that Maria Bárbara, the daughter of the Portuguese kings, was treated in Spain. The coldness that Mariana received was a reflection of the coldness that her family showed the Portuguese princess in Madrid, especially by her mother, Elizabeth Farnese. Unlike Mariana Victoria, who never displayed any interest in politics, Maria Bárbara had political aspirations, something that the power-hungry Elizabeth couldn't tolerate. In fact, Elizabeth seems to also be behind the animosity displayed by her daughter to the Queen of Portugal. It's interesting to note that the relationship between mother and daughter-in-law disintegrates at the same time that the relationship between Spain and Austria got worse. On top of that, Elizabeth Farnese practically brainwashed her daughter with anti-Austrian ideas, so it's not a surprise that she said that Mariana came from the most miserable of all nations. With the death of King John V in 1750, Mariana Victoria and her husband became kings of Portugal. She was finally out of the shadow of her mother-in-law. Mariana, on her side, finally free from the pressures of ruling, devoted her life to religion and discreetly retired from the public eye, giving her daughter-in-law the space she needed to try to become a good queen. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.